This is the only form of government which I have treated of at some length, for it is the one most akin to my purpose of showing the benefits of freedom in a state. I may pass over the fundamental principles of other forms of government, for we may gather from what has been said whence their right arises, without going into its origin. The possessor of sovereign power, whether he be one or many, or the whole body politic, has the sovereign right of imposing any commands he pleases, and he who has either voluntarily or under compulsion transferred the right to defend him to another has, in so doing, renounced his natural right, and is therefore bound to obey, in all things, the commands of the sovereign power, and will be bound so to do, so long as the king, or nobles, or the people preserve the sovereign power which formed the basis of the original transfer. I need add no more. The bases and rights of dominion being thus displayed, we shall readily be able to define private civil right, wrong, justice, and injustice with their relations to the state, and also to determine what constitutes an ally, or an enemy, or the crime of treason. By private civil right, we can only mean the liberty every man possesses to preserve his existence, a liberty limited by the edicts of the sovereign power, and preserved only by its authority. For when a man has transferred to another his right of living as he likes, which was only limited by his power, that is, has transferred his liberty and power of self-defense, he is bound to live as that other dictates, and to trust to him entirely for his defense. Wrong takes place when a citizen or subject is forced by another to undergo some loss or pain in contradiction to the authority of the law or the edict of the sovereign power. Wrong is conceivable only in an organized community, nor can it ever accrue to the subjects from any act of the sovereign, who has the right to do what he likes. It can only arise, therefore, between private persons who are bound by law and right not to injure one another. Justice consists in the habitual rendering to every man his lawful due. Injustice consists in depriving a man, under the pretense of legality, of what the laws, rightly interpreted, would allow him. These last are also called equity and inequity, because those who administer the law are bound to show no respect of persons, but to account all men equal, and to defend every man's right equally, neither envying the rich nor despising the poor. The men of two states become allies, when, for the sake of avoiding war, or for some other advantage, they covenant to do each other no hurt, but, on the contrary, to assist each other if necessity arises, each retaining his independence. Such a covenant is valid so long as its basis of danger or advantage is in force. No one enters into an engagement, or is bound to stand by his compacts, unless there be a hope of some accruing good, or the fear of some evil. If this basis be removed, the compact thereby becomes void. This has been abundantly shown by experience. For although different states make treaties not to harm one another, they always take every possible precaution against such treaties being broken by the stronger party, and do not rely on the compact, unless there is a sufficiently obvious object and advantage to both parties in observing it. Otherwise they would fear a breach of faith, nor would there be any wrong done thereby. For who in his sovereign senses, and aware of the right of the sovereign power, would trust in the promises of one who has the will and the power to do what he likes, and who aims solely at the safety and advantage of his dominion? Moreover, if we consult loyalty and religion, we shall see that no one in possession of power ought to abide by his promises to the injury of his dominion, for he cannot keep such promises without breaking the engagement he made with his subjects, by which both he and they are most solemnly bound. An enemy is one who lives apart from the state, and does not recognize its authority either as a subject or as an ally. It is not hatred which makes a man an enemy, but the rights of the state. The rights of the state are the same in regard to him who does not recognize by any compact the state authority, as they are against him who has done the state an injury. It has the right to force him, as best it can, either to submit or to contract an alliance. Lastly, treason can only be committed by subjects who, by compact, either tacit or expressed, have transferred all their rights to the state. A subject is said to have committed this crime when he has attempted, for whatever reason, to seize the sovereign power or to place it in different hands. I say has attempted, for if punishment were not to overtake him till he had succeeded, it would often come too late. The sovereign rights would have been acquired or transferred already. I also say has attempted, for whatever reasons, to seize the sovereign power, and I recognize no difference whether such an attempt should be followed by public loss or public gain. Whatever be his reason for acting, the crime is treason, and he is rightly condemned. In war, everyone would admit the justice of his sentence. If a man does not keep to his post, but approaches the enemy without the knowledge of his commander, whatever may be his motive, so long as he acts on his own motion, even if he advances with the design of defeating the enemy, he is rightly put to death, because he has violated his oath and infringes the rights of his commander. That all citizens are equally bound by these rights in time of peace is not so generally recognized, but the reasons for obedience are in both cases identical. The state must be preserved and directed by the sole authority of the sovereign, and such authority and right have been accorded by universal consent to him alone. If, therefore, anyone else attempts, without his consent, to execute any public enterprise, even though the state might, as we said, reap benefit therefrom, such person has nonetheless infringed the sovereign's right, and would be rightly punished for treason. In order that every scruple may be removed, we may now answer the inquiry whether our former assertion that everyone who has not the practice of reason may, in the state of nature, live by sovereign natural right, according to the laws of his desires, is not in direct opposition to the law and right of God as revealed. For as all men absolutely, whether they be less endowed with reason or more, are equally bound by the divine command to love their neighbor as themselves, it may be said that they cannot, without wrong, do injury to anyone, or live according to their desires. This objection, so far as the state of nature is concerned, can be easily answered, for the state of nature is, both in nature and in time, prior to religion. No one knows by nature that he owes any obedience to God, nor can he attain thereto by any exercise of his reason, but solely by revelation confirmed by signs. Therefore, previous to revelation, no one is bound by a divine law and right, of which he is necessarily in ignorance. The state of nature must by no means be confounded with the state of religion, but must be conceived as without either religion or law, and consequently without sin or wrong. This is how we have described it, and we are confirmed by the authority of Paul. It is not only in respect of ignorance that we conceive the state of nature as prior to, and lacking the divine revealed law and right, but in respect of freedom also, wherewith all men are born endowed. It may be insisted that sovereigns are as much bound by the divine law as subjects, whereas we have asserted that they retain their natural rights, and may do whatever they like. If men were naturally bound by the divine law and right, or if the divine law and right were a natural necessity, there would have been no need for God to make a covenant with mankind, and to bind them thereto with an oath and agreement. We must, then, fully grant that the divine law and right originated at the time when men, by express covenant, agreed to obey God in all things, and ceded, as it were, their natural freedom, transferring their rights to God in the manner described in speaking of the formation of a state. However, I will treat of these matters more at length presently. It may be insisted that sovereigns are as much bound by the divine law as subjects, whereas we have asserted that they retain their natural rights and may do whatever they like. In order to clear up the whole difficulty, which arises rather concerning the natural right than the natural state, I maintain that everyone is bound, in the state of nature, to live according to divine law, in the same way as he is bound to live according to the dictates of sound reason, namely, inasmuch as it is to his advantage, and necessary for his salvation. But if he will not so live, he may do otherwise at his own risk. He is thus bound to live according to his own laws, not according to anyone else's, and to recognize no man as a judge or as a superior in religion. Such, in my opinion, is the position of a sovereign, for he may take advice from his fellow men, but he is not bound to recognize any as a judge, nor any one besides himself as an arbitrator on any question of right, unless it be a prophet sent expressly by God and attesting his mission by indisputable signs. Even then, he does not recognize a man, but God himself as his judge. If a sovereign refuses to obey God as revealed in his law, he does so at his own risk and loss, but without violating any civil or natural right. For the civil right is dependent on his own decree, and natural right is dependent on the laws of nature, which latter are not adapted to religion, whose sole aim is the good of humanity, but to the order of nature, that is, to God's eternal decree, unknown to us. This truth seems to be adumbrated in a somewhat obscure form by those who maintain that men can sin against God's revelation, but not against the eternal decree by which he has ordained all things. We may be asked, what should we do if the sovereign commands anything contrary to religion, and the obedience which we have expressly vowed to God? Should we obey the divine law or the human law? I shall treat of this question at length hereafter, and will therefore merely say now that God should be obeyed before all else, when we have a certain and indisputable revelation of his will. But men are very prone to error on religious subjects, and, according to the diversity of their dispositions, are wont, with considerable stir, to put forward their own inventions, as experience more than sufficiently attests, so that if no one were bound to obey the state in matters which, in his own opinion, concern religion, the rights of the state would be dependent on every man's judgment and passions. No one would consider himself bound to obey laws framed against his faith or superstition, and on this pretext he might assume unbounded license. In this way, the rights of the civil authorities would be utterly set at naught, so that we must conclude that the sovereign power, which alone is bound both by divine and natural right to preserve and guard the laws of the state, should have supreme authority for making any laws about religion which it thinks fit. All are bound to obey its behests on the subject in accordance with their promise, which God bids them to keep. However, if the sovereign power be heathen, we should either enter into no engagements therewith, and yield up our lives sooner than transfer to it any of our rights. Or if the engagement be made, and our rights transferred, we should, inasmuch as we should have ourselves transferred the right of defending ourselves and our religion, be bound to obey them, and to keep our word. We might even rightly be bound so to do, except in those cases where God, by indisputable revelation, has promised his special aid against tyranny, or given us special exemption from obedience. Thus we see that of all the Jews in Babylon, there were only 3 youths who were certain of the help of God, and therefore refused to obey Nebuchadnezzar. All the rest, with the sole exception of Daniel, who was beloved by the king, were doubtless compelled by right to obey, perhaps thinking that they had been delivered up by God into the hands of the king, and that the king had obtained and preserved his dominion by God's design. On the other hand, Eleazar, before his country had utterly fallen, wished to give a proof of his constancy to his compatriots, in order that they might follow in his footsteps, and go to any lengths, rather than allow their right and power to be transferred to the Greeks, or brave any torture rather than swear allegiance to the heathen. Instances are occurring every day in confirmation of what I here advance. The rulers of Christian kingdoms do not hesitate, with a view to strengthening their dominion, to make treaties with Turks and heathens, and to give orders to their subjects, who settle among such peoples, not to assume more freedom, either in things secular or religious, than is set down in the treaty, or allowed by the foreign government. We may see this exemplified in the Dutch treaty with the Japanese, which I have already mentioned.